Okay, so welcome back. We are now starting part four. Hopefully, you have a good understanding of Nixon's foreign policy and some of his domestic agenda in terms of what was happening in the U.S. at the time. We are now going to move into Nixon's Southern strategy. This is important. This is a calculated effort to bring the South into the Republican Party. We've talked about this in class. Today you go look at the vote, the South votes solidly Republican. It starts with the civil rights movement. They are dissatisfied with the Democrats, but they don't know where to go. And Nixon gives them a home, okay? He wants the South. He needs the South to win re-election, so he goes for the Southern white vote, okay? How does he do it? He drags his feet on things like integration, housing, voting rights. He will reduce funding from programs that are designed for civil rights, okay? He will back Strom Thurmond. Remember Strom Thurmond, the Dixiecrat guy? This guy wants to stop school desegregation. They're still hung up on the Brown versus Board decision. So every time Nixon does something like this, the people sue the government and Nixon loses in court, okay? But it is a calculated effort. It is designed specifically. You can look in the book and you can look on the website. There's more information. Take a look at some of the stuff that's up there so that you have a good understanding of what's going on. Okay? So please, I ask you to do that. It is designed for this, and it is set up in such a way that from this point forward, at least until today, the South continues to stay solidly Republican. Okay? It's known as Nixon's Southern strategy. All right, next up, Nixon's got some problems, okay? Remember, he's the law and order president. He doesn't like things. So people in his administration start leaking information to the papers. And the biggest, most famous leak of all were called the Pentagon Papers. They're leaked by a guy named Daniel Ellsberg. And the New York Times is going to publish them. But Nixon says they can't publish them because it's confidential, it's state secrets, it's U.S. national security. You can't do that. The Times will sue the administration, the Nixon administration, and the Supreme Court will agree that the New York Times has the right to publish them under the First Amendment, freedom of the press. They can do whatever they want. Okay, the Pentagon Papers are published. Now, you have to understand what the Pentagon Papers are. It's all of the information and communications that traces itself back to Kennedy's administration, which proves to the American people that Kennedy and Johnson's administrations were lying to the people when they were talking about what's happening in Vietnam. In some respects, it doesn't really paint Nixon in a negative light, but he doesn't like the idea that people can leak this stuff out. So in retaliation, Nixon will have his people break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office and try to steal his psychiatric file so that he could publish the psychiatric file in the papers and have Daniel Ellsberg discredited. Okay? Nixon is a very vindictive president and person. Okay? He will use the Internal Revenue Service, the FBI. He will tap phones. He will read mail. He will use all sorts of dirty tricks to get at people who are on his enemies list. And Nixon has a very long enemies list. Okay? So if he doesn't like you and he's going to put you on that, you are in trouble. Now, in order to stop the leak, Nixon organizes a group of people that are led by Mitchell Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy. These people, remember, from his administration, his cabinet, and they become known as the plumbers. And it's as simple as you would hire a plumber to stop a leak in your pipe. You hire these plumbers, or Nixon gets these plumbers to stop governmental leaks. Okay? And here's where all the problems start. It begins with his 1972 re-election campaign. In 1972, Nixon wants to make sure he's going to win. he forms a committee, and the committee is known as the Committee to Re-elect the President. The acronym they come up with is CREEP. I wrote it, I'll say it. I'm not kidding. You cannot make this stuff up. They are known as CREEP. Okay? The Committee to Re-elect the President, headed by his famous plumbers. So what he does is he has the CREEP committee hire some low-level burglars to break into the Democratic Party headquarters, which resides in the Watergate office complex outside of Washington. And they break in, and they're going to steal some, notes and papers. Nixon has them do this because he wants to know what's going on. He wants to know the strategy of the Democratic Party so he can ensure he wins. This turns into a massive crisis that we know today as Watergate. And when you look at the two reporters who reported, Woodward and Bernstein, they are low-level reporters at the Washington Post during this time frame. And what they're doing is they're doing what every young reporter does when they first start their career. They're trolling the police files. Now, what happens is these plumbers get caught, these burglars rather, get caught breaking in. And they get caught, and security calls the police come and arrest them, and they're arrested for burglary. Nobody knows anything about this yet. When Woodward and Bernstein start looking at the police blotter, they notice that these group of burglars were broken into the Democratic headquarters. So they think that's kind of odd and interesting. And what they discover when they go down there is that in the wallet of one of these low-level burglars is the phone number of the Oval Office to the White House. And that starts them thinking, wait a minute, what is this criminal, this burglar, have this phone number for? So they start doing a little bit more investigating, and then Woodward and Bernstein get some information from a guy that is known as Deep Throat, okay? And that's his acronym, that's his cover name rather, and it's not going to be until the year like 2000, 2001 or 2, it's only recent in history that his identity. He was a marked up W. Mark Felt. He was a former FBI agent. Now, what happens is, as this starts to unravel, Nixon tries to use the FBI and the CIA and everybody else to cover it up, to squash the investigation. You can't look at this, you can't look at that. It's national security, it's state secrets, it's blah, blah, blah. And every time he tries to do this, more people become curious. And what happens is you get a congressional committee that starts investigating the White House. Now, it doesn't happen overnight. You get lots of stories coming up in the paper. The allegations are made that the president is involved in this. And then Congress, given the power to investigate in the Constitution, begins an investigation of Nixon's presidency. And what they discover is simply the tip of the iceberg in this case. Okay, it's just the beginning. So they start investigating, and they start calling people to Congress as witnesses. And what happens is they start to find out more and more about this. Now, while this is going on, Nixon's saying, I'm not a crook and I've never done anything wrong and blah, blah, blah. And we're going to look at a video of that in just a few minutes. And you'll get a better chance to see what's going on. All right. But what happens is one of Nixon's people, John Dean, one of his attorneys in his office there, is told to go to Congress, is subpoenaed by Congress to do things, to discuss what he knows. And while this is simply done as a question and answer process, while he's beginning to get questions, in one of his responses, he talks about the tape recordings in the Oval Office. And the investigators stop and look at each other, and then they go back and they ask him again, and what they discovered, nobody knew this, was that Nixon has been taping everything in the Oval Office. There are tape recordings of everything. This now blows up out of control. The committee stops everything and demands Nixon give them the tapes so they can listen to them. Nixon says, no, you can't have them. It's executive privilege. These are my tapes. The Congress will sue the president, and the Supreme Court rules against him, and Nixon is forced to turn over the tapes. So he does. He turns over the tapes. And when you start listening to the tapes, it's pretty clear what's going on. All right? So at this point, Congress is pretty confident that there's going to be some impeachment proceedings starting, and they start to do this, and Nixon will resign the presidency and Ford will become the new president. He is the first unelected president in America's history. And when I say unelected, you have to know what happens to Spiro Agnew. Agnew was elected with Nixon to be the vice president. He is indicted and brought up on charges of tax evasion for not paying his taxes. He is forced to resign as vice president. When Agnew resigns, Nixon is allowed to pick another vice president if Congress approves him. Nixon picked Gerald Ford, a congressman from Michigan. I think it was Michigan. Minnesota, Michigan, one of those states. Maybe Minnesota. Gerald Ford becomes the vice president. He was not elected by the people as part of the ticket. So when Nixon is forced to resign the presidency in August of 1974, Ford becomes the next president of the United States. And that is why I say Ford is the first unelected president of the United States. Okay? So something to think about. Also, while this is taking place, something else that you need to understand happens, and that is the War Powers Act. Remember the Tonkin Gulf Resolution? Remember we said that the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave the president a blank check to wage war? It did, and Vietnam was the result of that. So in 1973, Congress thinks it's given too much. It wants to rein the power back in, so it passes the War Powers Act. Nixon vetoed it. Of course, what president would veto it, taking away some of his power? But Nixon vetoes the War Powers Act, and as a result, Congress will pass it overriding Nixon's veto. And it is still in place today. If the president puts in troops, he's got to let Congress know. He must have congressional approval after more than 60 days. Congress can always cut off funding if they want. They rarely do, but they can cut off funding if they want. And at this time, we now have Ford as the president of the United States, right? So I'm going to stop this here, and on the next part, we'll begin with about a 4.5, 5-minute video on Nixon and Watergate, and then we'll continue with Ford's administration and Carter's administration. So I'll be right back.